So where we are in the book of Exodus, we're in chapter 3. Moses is already an adult. He tried to deliver his people, the Jewish people, in his strength. And they found him out, and he had to escape because Pharaoh found out that he had killed one of the taskmasters. And so Moses ends up in Midian, and he becomes a shepherd. And the irony there is he was the prince of Egypt. So he's going from being a prince to a shepherd. And again, we know from Genesis that the Egyptians hated shepherds. They loathed them. And so that's very symbolic of him going from the highest position he could possibly have on earth to probably one of the lowest. And 40 years go by, and then God comes to him in the burning bush. So chapter 3 says, and we did some of this, we'll review some of it. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. So when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out from out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And so we're not going to kind of go over this ground. We covered this in depth last week, just the holiness of God and God's using Moses' name repeated twice and Moses' response. And so God is showing Moses here his holiness. It's a reminder of who God is. And so in this episode, God talks about his plan to deliver the Israelites, and he commissions Moses. And again, Moses is about 80, if not exactly 80. He's old. He doesn't want to go back. And so he has objections, and that's what we're going to see in our text today. The Lord said, Surely I've seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of the taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So earlier Moses had tried to deliver his people, but God is showing that these are actually his own people, God's people. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and spacious land. Up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Again, he repeats, Now behold, the cries of the sons of Israel has come to me. So God is over and over saying how these cries have come to him. What's interesting is, again, this is like 80 years since Pharaoh was killing the children, and the people have been crying out. They've been crying out for centuries. But God wasn't ready then, but now he's ready. Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. We did this last week. Okay. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? What I put in yellow here are Moses' objections. And you're going to see them on your sheet there. And at the end, we'll kind of go through we'll go through all the objections all at once. But Moses is going to have kind of a debate with God, 5 of them, 5 main objections. And God will answer them. And he said, Certainly I will be with you. And this shall be the sign to you. That it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. What's interesting about the sign? Or confusing about the sign? So Moses has an objection. Who am I that I'm a nobody. I can't go to Pharaoh. He'll kill me. And God's sign to Moses, does his sign to Moses answer that?
Not really. That's in the future too.
Right.
I mean, that's not even come to pass.
Right. If we want a sign, when do we want it? Now. Give me a sign now that I may know. And God says, well, this will be the sign to you. You're not going to get the sign until after I've already done what I'm saying I'm going to do. And sure enough, in a few chapters, they will be at that mountain. But it's going to take some time to get there. And so we don't always like the signs that God gives us, and yet how often does that happen in our own lives, that we are confused about how what God's will is and what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to walk this out, and we feel like we're floundering about, and then only in the future do we then get some realization, some sign from God that all of this had been worked out and God was in it from the beginning. So that's just kind of a interesting point, and I'm sure it really didn't make Moses too assured of wanting to go to Egypt, because he'll have some more objections. So Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. Some of the words are missing here. What I'm showing you is, this is what's known as a chiastic structure, or chiasm, where the pattern follows in one direction to a central point, and then as it recedes, it's in reverse order following the same thing. So Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me what is his name, so then God kind of repeats that. Tell them the God of your fathers sent me to you. I am has sent me to you. What's his name? I am has sent me to you. God says to Moses, Moses said to God. So, God said to Moses, God said to Moses. It's hinged on the point, I am who I am, the name of God. God says, I am sent me to you. And if you were at church on Sunday, we talked about that ever-present, ever-existent name of God. In the book of Revelation, God refers to himself as the one who is, who was, who? Yes, thank you. You were paying attention and I forgot.
I was.
And that's used over and over again. And that's a verb of being. I am who I am. It's ever existent, ever present, always there. Jesus, of course, says, before Abraham was, I am. And they picked up stones to throw at him because they knew he was referring back to this claim of God. Okay. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I am indeed concerned about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. So I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite, the Perizzite and the Hivite and Jebusite, to the land flowing with milk and honey. So God continually referring back to his covenant promises. We've talked about that. They will pay heed to what you say, and with the elders of Israel will come to the king of Egypt. And you will say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, so now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go, except under compulsion, so I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles which I shall do in the midst of it, and after that he will let you go. What does that make you think? What thoughts come to mind as you hear that, if you're Moses particularly?
Well, first thing I want to know is, what are you going to do? I mean, how in the world are you going to persuade this guy who's already trying to kill me? I mean, how are you going to get him to lift that oil off my head? You know?
It reminds me of Isaiah. So God commissions Isaiah to go and to go to the peoples and to spread, and he says, and they're not going to listen to you, but you're going to go anyway. You know, it's like, man, what a fruitless task. You know, so this is what Moses fears, isn't it? But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go.
Why all the drama? Why don't you just show your mighty hand and we'll go out?
Right. Yeah, and then we all kind of think that. All right, Lord, I get the point. You're in control and you're sovereign. Okay, I admit it. Can't you just bring about what we need now? Why do I have to go through the struggle?
Yeah.
Because Moses knows that even if he has faith here, whether or not he does, he knows that this is going to bring him pain. In other words, he's going to have to go through the struggle. I'll grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. But every woman shall ask of her neighbor, and the woman who lives in her house, articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters, thus you will plunder the Egyptians. This is a very neat prophecy. When we get to that point, I'm going to see if I can find, there's some archaeological evidence that kind of proves this from the Egyptian standpoint. But what's neat about this is God tells that to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. Centuries before. It actually happens in Exodus 11 and Exodus 12. In Exodus 11, they're asking the Egyptians to give them stuff, and in Exodus 12, they come out with all this stuff. There's an Egyptian, it's not a carving, it's kind of like a bronze thing, and it talks about, in very mystical language, and so skeptics don't want to line it up to the Bible, but it talks about the sun going dark, and from an Egyptian standpoint, what they experienced in the plagues. And then it says, and the slave girls left with something like jewelry and all this stuff. And this is an Egyptian artifact. But archaeologists don't want to associate the two. And so anyway, I'll see if I can scrounge that up and show us when we get to 11 and 12. But the Jewish people will plunder the Egyptians. And this is emblematic of what the church does to the world. As people are rescued from darkness to light, do they not bring the gifts of the world into the church? So if you're a skilled craftsman or artist, like we have artists at this church or whatever, now you're in the church with these beautiful gifts that you get to use for the glory of God and for the edification of the body and then for light to shine out into the world. And so there is some kind of foreshadowing there with what's going to happen in the church as people come out of their slavery into the promised land. Moses said, "What if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, the Lord has not appeared to you." The Lord said to him, "What is that in your hand?" He said, "A staff." Then he said, "Throw it on the ground." So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. The Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand and grasp it by its tail." So he stretched out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of the fathers, Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. And if you know the story, he'll have to do this, and he'll have kind of a showdown with the magicians of Egypt. The Lord furthermore said to him, "Now put your hand in your bosom." And he put his hand into his bosom. When he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then he said, "Put your hand in your bosom again." He put it in his bosom again. And when he took it out of his bosom, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. So he's showing Moses, I'm going to give you, he's actually giving him real signs now. Not some future thing, but look, these things you're going to get to do, or I will do through you. They will not believe you or heed the witness of the first sign, they may believe the witness of the last. But if they will not believe even these two signs or heed what you say, then you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on dry ground, and the water which you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. We know that's what happens in one of the plagues. I know we're going fast, but then we're going to slow down through it. So Moses said, "Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since you have spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." I put ha. That's really was a signal for me to make sure I include the verse from Acts, but I forgot it and left it in there. Because what's funny about that?
Didn't you say one time he'd been a general
Yeah.
in the Egyptian army? Yeah, he was a bunch of educated.
We think that, yeah.
A bunch of educated men in Egypt, probably.
Right, so in Acts chapter 7, it says Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was what? A man of power in words and deeds. So, and we know he was trained in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and from extra biblical sources, he was a general at one point. So, can he fool God? He says neither recently nor in time past. The Lord has said to him, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now then go, and I, even I, will be your mouth, and teach you what you are to say. But he said, "Please, Lord, now send the message by whomever you will." That's the NASB translation. I used a lot of slides from a friend of mine, and he always used the NASB, the scripture slides. The ESV says, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." And when you look this up in like an interlinear in the Hebrew is complex. But that's basically what he's saying, because you know from God's response, "And the anger of the Lord burned against Moses. And he said, Is there not your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he speaks fluently. And moreover, behold, he is coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart." So God will give Moses a companion. "You are to speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I, even I, will be with your mouth and his mouth, and I will teach you what you are to do. Moreover, he shall speak for you to the people, and he will be as a mouth for you, and you will be as God to him. You shall take in your hand the staff with which you shall perform the signs." And so you have this transmission from God to Moses to Aaron to the people. Again, kind of like as we're studying Revelation, how it went from the Father to the Son, to an angel to John to the people. I know it says, "And God got anger burned against Moses," but like, it is kind of sweet how God indulges us, isn't it? I mean, but he gives Moses a companion. And I think that's instructive for us, how he puts people in our lives to help us walk difficult things out. Any thoughts? I know we went through some of that fast. Yeah.
I think you see also God's grace, his repeated provision, even in the midst of rebellion. You take it all the way back to the garden, and after their sin, he provided them with clothing. And so you kind of see this carried through, even all the way to the end, of course. But it's kind of just fleshing itself out right here.
Yeah, I like that. God always, I think I said that a few weeks ago when we talked about Jesus as the high priest, but God always provides and supplies what he commands and asks of us. He's never going to ask you something that he's not going to empower you to walk in. I don't like saying God will never give you more than you can handle. I think he continually gives us more than we can handle in our own strength. Right? But he will empower you and enable you to do what you're unable to do. We just don't like that. I mean, I'm with Moses. I don't want to go to Pharaoh, So, great point, Jason. So here's this was a slide my friend had, and I'll use it, and then I'll have it kind of in my own words. But you see kind of three. Moses has an excuse, God has an answer, and then God will provide a sign. And these are, they're out of order. Okay, and then these are more like paraphrased. So Moses' first excuse is, "I'm not qualified," and God says, "I'll be with you." And the sign is a future sign, which we said that doesn't do us very good right now. "You shall worship God at this mountain." The next one is, "I don't know enough. I don't even know your name." Again, that's a paraphrase. God says, "My name is I am that I am." And the sign is, "You will plunder the Egyptians." Once again, a future sign. Moses says, "They're not going to believe me." So now God gives him physical signs to strengthen his own faith, but to show, "Look at what I'll do through you." So throw down your rod, it becomes a snake, and also the leper's hand. Moses says, "I'm not eloquent." God said, "Well, I'm the one who made your mouth. I'll be your mouth." He says, "Send someone else." And God says, "Okay, I'll send Aaron, but you're going too. And the sign will be, you're going to see Aaron." And we just kind of like read over that, but remember, they hadn't probably seen each other in 40 years. So the fact that they're going to cross paths, and I don't know that for sure. We're reading between the lines there, but okay. So to go through those same kind of questions, the way I have them on your sheet. So the first one Moses says is in verse 11, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" That whole idea of who am I? I'm a nobody. He's basically saying, I don't have the authority. I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy of that task. So these are some blanks on your sheet if you feel like filling them in. I'll also put them on the website. Let's see. God's response, I will be with, oh yeah, we already said that.
Say it again.
Yeah, we can write.
I will be with you.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Say it again. I'll be with you and you will be successful, essentially. The next one is Exodus 4, 1-5. Behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. No, I'm sorry, that's not it. Exodus 3:13. If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is your name? What shall I say to them? I don't know what I'm going to say to them. I'm not going to have the answers that they're going to ask me. And how many of us are kind of afraid to go into situations that people are going to ask us things that we don't have the answers to? God's response is, I am that I am. He gave him the name. The God of your father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Next one. Okay, the next objection is Exodus 4:1. He says, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. I won't be successful. I won't be believed. God says, believe me, I'm going to do mighty things through you that will prove who you are. And again, I'm giving you my paraphrases behind these questions, that you can just get the real answers from Scripture that we've already read. I'm trying to kind of globalize these concepts to ourselves, because don't we all sort of have the same objections when we're called to do a tough thing, when we're called to serve in ministry or whatever. And the fourth one, oh my Lord, I'm not eloquent either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. He's basically saying, I'm not qualified. You're telling me to go and speak. You're telling me to do something I'm not qualified to do. I'm not good enough to do. And God, of course, says, I will help you and teach you. It's basically God's response. I will help you and teach you. And then Moses, just in the most honest question of every, or objection that he gave out of every objection, when he says, oh Lord, please send somebody. I just don't want to go. Was that the bottom line of all this other stuff? Like, if I can't convince you with logic, I'm just telling you my heart. And in that, isn't it, I know what's best for my life? You know.
And Moses is a model of Christ in the Old Testament. When Jesus said the same thing to the Father, he didn't say send somebody else. He said, if it be within your will, take us away from you. So that was a model of Christ in the Old Testament. Send someone else, take this away from you.
Yeah, if there's another way.
There's another
He
way.
did say that. Can any of you relate to some of these objections?
Oh, yeah.
You know, sometimes it might be in ministry, it might be in serving in the church, you know, and maybe you're asked to do something, you just don't feel like you'll have the respect or authority to do what you're being asked to do. Or maybe it's at work. Or maybe it's you're called to coach your son's Little League team or whatever. Whatever it is, aren't these objections kind of universal? And we have a fear of failing. And doesn't fear of failure cripple us? You know, we don't feel qualified. We don't feel good enough. We don't have enough self-worth as an image bearer of God to kind of do these things that we're asked to do. And really, at the end of the day, this is always just what it is. It's whatever, you stick all this stuff in a big funnel, what comes out at the end is, I just don't want to do what I'm being asked. You know? And because we're afraid, right? I mean, what other reasons would there be? What are the other reasons?
We're comfortable.
Oh, that's good. So it might not be fear, but it might just be comfort. I don't want to get uncomfortable. I think that's really good.
It could also be that he's 80 years old now.
And nothing has happened up to this point, so how can I know that this is gonna happen? I mean, doesn't seem to make sense.
Do you think, besides his age, which is true, and yet what he does in his older age is quite phenomenal? I mean, I'm sure he physically put me to, traipsing through the wilderness like that and herding sheep. But do you think his past failure is informing this? I mean, didn't he do this already?
Yeah.
Right? They didn't believe him. They did say, "Who are you? Are you going to do this to us? Are you going to strike us down like you did?" And so oftentimes I think our own past failures color how we want to move, if and how we're going to move forward. Maybe we just give up, But God doesn't give up on Moses. As a matter of fact, this was required to bring Moses to a point in order for him to be used by God and to serve other people. Because Moses before did it out of his own accomplishment and strength. He's a general in Pharaoh's army who grew up in the household of Pharaoh. He probably had allies. He probably had connections. He was a perfect guy to raise up this Israelite army. But had he done that, then he gets the credit. Yes?
He was probably pretty comfortable and content where he was at this point in life too, with his family out in the wilderness after that many years,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just comfort. I think that's, don't we get comfortable here? So, last week I compared that, the killing of the Egyptian, does that remind you of anything? And I associated it to the New Testament when Peter sees an injustice about to take place and pulls out his knife or his sword and he cuts off the high priest's servant's ear. And I think we see a lot of similar correlations. And so we went through that. I changed it up a little bit as I found a couple more things. But they're both, Moses was in Pharaoh's inner circle and Peter's in Christ's inner circle. And they both take matters into their own hands. Moses for Israel's deliverance, and Peter believes he's going to kind of initiate and bring on the kingdom of God for Christ. I mean, how absurd, right? Moses kills that taskmaster. Peter cuts ear off. Anyway, you get the point. So for all of you that don't like it when I call these things fleas, I did change it to flea instead of the little bug. When he is accused by his people, he flees afraid, and when he is accused by his people, he flees afraid. Remember, I'm trying to fit it in boxes too, so grammar is not important. Moses, when he does that, he goes back to what his people knows. I know Moses wasn't a shepherd, but it is very symbolic that he goes back to the profession of his people. It's showing an identification with his people for the first time in his life, really. And Peter goes back to what he knows, fishing. I don't know, I guess I'll go fishing. In other words, do we ever go back to our old patterns in life when we get confused, when our world is rocked, when we think we're doing God's will, and then suddenly the carpet comes out from under us, and now we just don't, I'll just go back to what I know. And that's what you see going on there. Moses has these 5 objections. We know Peter had 3 denials. And at the point where Moses was broken, he was restored and commissioned, and we said at the burning bush. And Peter had a charcoal fire, a burning fire. And so we see an interesting pattern between this Old Testament, New Testament person. And it's at the point of restoration where they can be really used by God. And so if you read like John 20, and you see Christ restoring Peter, now it's like, okay, now Peter, do you remember that? Jesus asks him what? You remember what Jesus asked him?
You love me.
You love me. What does he say?
You know,
You know I do. And he asked him 3 times, and Peter was grieved by that because it harkened back to the 3 denials. And then if you've ever heard a teaching on that, there's 5 words for love in the Greek, and Peter says, Jesus uses the word for phileo, and what does Peter say? Agape?
Agape.
Yeah, but then Peter changes it at the end. In other words, Peter's broke. He realizes.
I got it backwards.
Yeah, it's backwards. All right. The point is there's restoration, and then Peter goes on to be a bold proclaimer of the faith. In Acts, And he still messes up, because we'd expect nothing less from Peter and me. So. And it's cool, Moses was called a friend of God, and we know Peter is a close friend of Christ. He actually tells him, I no longer call you servants or whatever, I call you friend. So, we already kind of talked through this last week about trying to bring about God's plans on our own strength and power. Abraham does that, does he not, with Sarah and Hagar? It's a pattern. It's the pattern for all of us. But there is a New Testament. New Testament's very clear about it. Whereas the Old Testament may be showing you in narrative and illustration, the New Testament's clear. So Paul says they had this thorn in the flesh. And we don't know exactly what that is, but 3 seasons of prayer. Lord, remove this from me. And God did it. And Paul actually said it was to keep him from becoming prideful. You know. And so what Paul says is, Christ says to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, Paul says, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And it's just a reminder that God's going to use us in our weakness, and that's actually how he wants to use us. And that's not comfortable for us. But it's also the best place to be, to see God's power manifest in your life, when you know that you just accomplished something that you didn't accomplish. Right. And that the King of the universe chose you to work through to do this. It's humbling. So, this is Isaiah 40. I love this. Have you not known, have you not heard, the Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. That's supposed to be down more. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youth shall faint and be weary. So the point is, some translations say young men. In other words, the strongest of you are still going to get tired. Oh, there it is. And young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. In other words, you are at your strongest when you're at your weakest, because then God is working in and through you. And doesn't God give Moses a lot of energy and patience for those stiff-necked people that he's about to lead? The Lord shall renew their strength. Okay. Word from Joshua. That's probably too small to see. But have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Now, oftentimes that's all that's used, and it's like, toughen up, be strong. Well, no, it's not about being strong in your own might. It says, do not be frightened and do not be dismayed. Why? For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. You could be strong and courageous because the Lord is with you. Of course, that doesn't mean going out ahead of him. Sometimes we think because we're Christians, God is with us, and then God will follow us, and that's not the way it is. He's not going to follow you into battle just because you decide to go. But he'll be with you. So that's like this paradigm where we don't serve out of strength, but we serve out of weakness. And Peter, Moses shows you that. There's another great one with Esther. Can anybody think of some parallels with Moses and Esther? So if you know the Esther story, she wins a beauty contest, ends up in the palace of, is it Artaxerxes? In his harem, but apparently one of his favorite wives. And then she's made aware of a plot to kill the Jewish people. And she has a choice to make if she's going to try to intervene with the king about the slaughter of her people. So both Moses and Esther were adopted. She was basically adopted by her cousin. It says her cousin raised her as if she were his own daughter. Some people say that was her uncle. The ESV says that her parents were his uncle. Anyway, And then we know Moses was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. These are going to be out of order, I guess. So Moses received the finest Egyptian education and training, and she received the finest Persian health and beauty care and the best foods. It's just showing that they both received the best of whatever it is in their culture. These are all over the place. Let's just fill them in. So Moses is brought into Pharaoh's house, and she's brought into the king's house. Moses objects to rescuing God's people due to inadequacy, and she objects due to inadequacy. She says, I can't go before the king. He hasn't summoned me.
You got a rule.
He could kill me. In Moses' weakness, God delivers his people. In Esther's hopelessness, because she didn't know. She knew when she walked into that, he could kill her. We don't live in that world anymore. God delivers his people in their hopelessness. Now here's the key point in the two. Moses is made to identify with his people, a shepherd and weak, to be able to serve and rescue them. And Esther is made to identify with her people through fasting and in prayer to serve and rescue them. Let me show you that. I can do it from the paper here. So she objects, just like Moses has an objection. Mordecai, the cousin, says this: do not think to yourself that in the king's palace he will escape any more than any other of the Jews. She was comfortable in the king's palace. In other words, that's nice that this plot's going on, but, my life's kind of good. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether or not you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. It's the kind of famous scripture that we like to quote. And so, she's in this position of power. She doesn't want to risk her neck to serve her people. But there's going to be a shift in her. So Esther says, go tell this to Mordecai. Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And then she says this: and I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So you see, she's going to do what her people are doing. She shouldn't have to do that. But it's a point in time where she's going to then identify with them. This is such an important thing for Christians to understand. So often we try to serve people from a position of power. So we're going to go feed the homeless, or we're going to go do inner city ministry, or we're going to go on a mission trip. If we go as if we are the all-powerful American, people want to be helped, so they'll take your help. But you saw in Moses' case, it didn't impress the Israelites. But it's when you could come alongside somebody because they're fellow image bearers of God. They're the same as you. Maybe you had a better upbringing, maybe you had different circumstances in your life. When you lord that over somebody, that dehumanizes them. But coming alongside them is just the most beautiful thing in the world. And then you can serve a people. And so that's what we're called to do. We're called to, that's what Jesus did. Let's go to that slide first. Philippians 2. Christ did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant and being made in the likeness of men. Christ took our flesh. We don't really get how condescending that is. It's because, hey, we're not so bad. He's God. We're going to see a picture of him from Revelation on Sunday. We're going to see who he is. He gave that up to be us. He emptied himself. It actually says Moses, there was a shift in Moses' thinking, and I think it's taking Moses' whole life and applying it at once. I don't know at what point this shift, but it says, by faith, this is Hebrews, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the approach of Christ greater than the riches, treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So Moses had a point where he had to no longer be thinking, I'm an Egyptian, but I am a Jew. And then it took probably even longer for him to realize, but that means I have to be fully stripped of this Egyptianness and lead them in my weakness, not in my strength. 1 Corinthians 9, Paul says, it's pretty small, to the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. It's again a kind of a call to us Christians. It doesn't mean we sin to reach sinners, but it does mean we go where people are and we relate to them and we identify with them. Hebrews 2, again, about Christ. Therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the presence of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. And that's why, if people understand that you know what they're going through, they're more apt to respond. And so we need to come and be like others. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. That's Christ. And so why I really like this lesson is kind of those three points that I'm making here. One is we have the same objections that Moses has. When you boil them down, the reason I boiled them down from the scripture text to the objection kind of under the objection is because then you see we have all the same objections. We don't think we're qualified. We don't think we're good enough. We don't, whatever it is. We don't think we'll be successful. The second thing is when we do serve, we think we ought to do that out of a position of strength. These are my gifts. This is how I serve. Well, Moses apparently was a good speaker. And God made it so that he made him come back when he wasn't a good speaker. And that's the way it is. God's going to use us in our weakness. And then the third thing is when we serve people, we are called to identify with them. And even a person that is on the total opposite end of the spectrum from you, racially, religiously, politically, socioeconomically, that's an image bearer of God. And so we can identify with them. And they have struggles like we have struggles. And they need a Savior the same way we need a Savior. And so we can come alongside people, not in a condescending way, but we can actually condescend to them, if you get what I mean. So, any thoughts or questions on today's? A lot to think about, hopefully. Good. Well, we'll pray.